Make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
It seems like a lot of folks who are affiliated with the Claremont Institute want to burn democracy down. Not every single one of them, obviously, but they never really call out those who cross those boundaries. And it's really quite an about-face from an organization that claims to be conservative. At this point, I would say they're not remotely conservative, they're radicals.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, Will. Thanks.
And we have with us returning to the show, Katherine Stewart. She is a world-renowned reporter that covers all kinds of stuff, specifically dealing with faith and politics. She's the author of I forgot your book's name. What's your book name? It's right there behind you. The Power Worshippers.
Thank you so much, Willis. The title is The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism.
Yeah, and this week we're gonna chat with Katherine about a really phenomenal article that is on the front page of the New Republic, entitled "The Claremont Institute, the Anti-Democracy Think Tank." So, I guess we can just start there. Like, why did you choose to write this article?
Well, thanks so much to you both. I just want to say, Josh and Will, for being here this morning. So first I want to say what the Claremont Institute is, and then we can talk about why I thought it was important to write this piece. So the Claremont Institute is a think tank that came together in the late 1970s when some graduate students who were inspired by the political philosophy professor Harry Jaffa decided to sort of form a democracy building organization, think tank, and it saw its original mission. It was always conservative, but saw its original mission as bolstering democracy and America's founding principles, and exploring philosophy to do that. It was always conservative, but it's actually taken a turn. It's become exceedingly more and more reactionary over time, to the point where at this point it's become frankly hostile to democracy. So it is a think tank. It's they run a couple of publications. They have a fellowship program that brings in a lot of people, and they try to insert themselves into the political process and have had quite a bit of success with that. So I decided to write this piece because a lot of people were seeing that under DeSantis's leadership, Florida, especially in relation to its education program, is taking what they would see as an authoritarian turn. The people who are behind former President Donald Trump's attempted coup are frankly, dangerous. And you can find the supposed intellectual justifications for some of these things in the work that actually takes place at the Claremont Institute. The Claremont Institute provides today a platform for white nationalists. It's become a lot of the people involved in the Institute, like their social media has become a repository for racial hate. They provide a platform for insurrectionists. John Eastman, co-conspirator too. This is sort of his intellectual home. He's on the board of directors. And a lot of the contributors to the publications of the Claremont Institute, they actually are supporters of political violence and fundamental illiberalism, I would say. It seems like a lot of folks who are affiliated with the Claremont Institute want to burn democracy down. Not every single one of them, obviously, but they never really call out those who cross those boundaries. And it's really quite an about-face from an organization that claims to be conservative. At this point, I would say they're not remotely conservative, they're radicals.
Yeah. So do you happen to know any like demographic information about, the composition of the students that attend, and where is the Claremont Institute located?
The Claremont Institute is based in California. It's not affiliated with the Claremont colleges in any way, but it is based in Claremont, California, and they have a satellite now in Florida that Ron DeSantis helped them set up. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but if you look at their staff, almost everyone in every position, apart from maybe, operations and things like that, is a man, overwhelmingly white, but, almost nearly all male. I just, frankly, this morning looked at their new list of fellows. You bring in a fellowship class every year. And I think there was something like, I don't know, maybe 11 or 13 men and 1 woman. So they very much skew male. So I can't give you an exact breakdown of the.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So probably no robust DEI program at the Claremont.
Oh my God, they basically see DEI as the enemy, as the devil. I mean, Claremont at this point is one of the main purveyors of, I don't know, can we call it neo-fascist? An ideology that's frankly driving much of the politics in the sort of extreme wing of the Republican Party today, which is, unfortunately, the sort of insurrectionist wing. I mean, when you hear somebody talk about woke, and when you hear them describe DEI programs as a form of tyranny, not just like, an annoyance, but an actual national emergency that's, that's the worst problem that America is facing. Or when you hear people claiming that all the institutions of culture or all of the universities in America have been captured by a leftist revolutionary elite, this kind of hyperbolic language, these are all ideas manufactured and disseminated by Claremont, and they're used to justify an essentially authoritarian response. I want to give an example of that response. I mean, the rhetoric of political violence actually makes its way into the pages of both of their publications, and even comes out in some of their podcasts. So they recently did a long excerpt of a book by a fellow named Kevin Slack. He's a professor at Hillsdale College, and gosh, I don't have the quote right in front of me. But they chose to highlight this very long excerpt of his book where he said it's time for conservatives to, quote, ally with the AR-15 crowd. And then he affirmatively described how people are forming militias and training with their weapons. And they see this as the kind of response to the principles of equality and pluralism that represent the best of the American promise.
So that is fascinating to me. And as I was doing some reading for this podcast and thinking through your article and looking at some of the different paths that are taken in your article and the criticisms, how do we get here from essentially the 70s with, you said, Harry Jaffa? And then Leo Strauss, right, was before him, and educated Harry Jaffa, right? Okay, so where did we get, like for instance, one thing that fascinated me was this idea of Strauss about a noble lie, that you could that essentially a lot of the proletariat, I guess, the people don't understand and can't handle the harsh realities of life. So it needs to be up to a specific amount, a certain group of elites who understand it, who can help. How do we get from this intellectual idea and concept? How do we move from that to get where we are today, where you're saying that they're, representing white supremacy and things like taking over the Capitol and stuff like that? I mean, obviously on January 6th, that, you're making a direct connection to January 6th. Kind of talk to us a little bit about how we got here.
Well, it's interesting. After I published the piece, I heard from Harry Jaffa's son, Philip, who reached out to basically offer an endorsement of my analysis. And I'm going to call it up just for a second, because here's what he told me. Because, he actually offered quite a lot of insight into how he thinks that Claremont Institute lost his way, and he thinks his father would be horrified and was horrified as he saw the change taking place. He spoke specifically about Charles Kessler. He said, I'm going to quote here because I have the quote in front of me. He said, Kessler is a nihilist, an Eastern Straussian. He doesn't believe that morality exists at all. But you don't want to live in a society where people believe that. So you teach morality to everyone else while keeping the deep, dark secret to yourself that it's all an illusion. Rules for thee and no rules for me. That's what he said. And he said, that his father was also no fan of Eastman or what the Institute had become. After its founding, he was very interested in preserving democracy, and he was, frankly, pro-immigration, while Eastman and some of the other Claremonters, in his view, were just more out for themselves and had no moral core. He said that his father said to him, they put a top hat on Jefferson Davis, as you know, sort of the Confederate leader Jefferson Davis, and call him Abraham Lincoln. So they have this sort of reactionary desire for social control, for social hierarchy. There's racism and sexism obviously baked into that, but they're calling these the founding principles and ascribing them to people like Lincoln, which is really inappropriate. And then Philip Jaffa said to me, this is an anarchist movement. The triumph of the libertarian wing of the conservative movement is Claremont, which is an anarchist movement. And anarchists destroy things. If you take a look at Trump's plan, it's just dismantling things, but this is what anarchists do. So I thought that this was really interesting, that he, who was sort of present at the creation of the Claremont Institute and was sort of very engaged through his father in its various iterations, had seen this type of decline. And when I was researching the piece, I reached out to Bill Kristol and Stephen Schmidt, who are both sort of, I would say, more traditional conservatives. Schmidt had something to say. He said, something to the effect, I'm going to paraphrase here, that conservatism is the sector of the political spectrum that can get sort of subsumed when you have an essentially authoritarian, or he used the word fascist, response that sort of takes over conservatism, sort of eats it up and spits out this kind of weird nihilism.
Yeah. So in the article, you also mentioned sort of this concept of manliness being a dog whistle, like in the Claremont world. Like, can you explain like what you mean by that?
Sure. I described it as a dog whistle, but I actually think it's kind of a bullhorn. The Institute is really not doing anything to hide their misogyny, and frankly, I think it makes their position more attractive to people with a certain type of reactionary mindset. The misogyny plays to their resentments, their insecurities, and fantasies of power. The fact is, and we could sort of go into how the misogyny is expressed and how it plays out, but there are a number of fellows who are involved or published in the Claremont Institute or involved in their operations who write explicitly, effusively, over-obsessively about gender hierarchy. And in doing this, and they deride women with some of them with most incredible vulgarities. Then you have some, like this one guy who calls himself raw egg nationalist, who's been published in The American Mind a number of times, who has mused, he said, maybe there are uses, we need to consider that there are uses for inequality. Maybe men and women shouldn't work together in the same spaces. And think about that. Like you're talking about gender segregated hospitals and businesses and schools. Like, this is Taliban level stuff. And and then there's some who say stuff that's, believe it or not, even worse. And you can't think that everyone affiliated with the Claremont Institute is a misogynist or would endorse these ideas. But what they are doing by giving these folks a platform and never reining them in, never challenging them on it, is giving a shout out to misogynists and racist reactionaries. It's like offering a permission structure for this kind of thought. It's telling people in the manosphere, the sort of toxic online communities, it's okay to let it all hang out and be as bigoted as you want. You can feel free to be so-called politically incorrect, dehumanize whole sectors of people, and they do this, frankly, with race as well. They call any effort to teach about America's, 250 years of slavery and its consequences. They call it woke communism. And this is, part of what is shaping the education agenda in Florida under DeSantis and his sort of Claremont buddies who are sort of helping him.
Yeah. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's all right. So I just want to say this type of permission structure, is toxic. It's always been there, but to give it a bullhorn like this is really something else.
Yeah. How much of that is connected to what I think you call or I don't know if it's you or the Claremont Institute calls a crisis of masculinity? Like how are they connected? Is it Claremont thinks that men aren't being manly enough or something like that?
Well, the crisis of masculinity can and does reflect some serious problems in our political economy. And I think they're very much tied to economics. We have the erosion of working and middle-class wages, the decline in traditionally male professions like manufacturing, the decline of job security, and the rise of a winner-take-all economy. And thanks to decades of regressive tax policies and policies that haven't protected the American workforce, we have this rising inequality that makes it harder to form and maintain healthy families. Unfortunately, the Claremont Institute and other right-wing, I would call them manliness mongers, right? They completely ignore the actual roots of the problem, which are largely economic. And instead, they turn their fire on supposedly cultural explanations. They blame the women, the gays, the liberals who make them feel bad about themselves. But what they're doing is actually worse than ignoring the actual problem. They tend to make it worse by linking their pro-manliness politics to the kind of regressive and misguided economic policies that created the crisis in the first place.
That's fascinating. One thing that's tied to what Will said when he's talking about the manliness is this idea, which just made me think about it, this idea of the Bronze Age pervert that you talk about, and the Bronze Age mindset, right? And you talk about the Bronze Age nuttery. So talk about what is going on there. Who's trying to get us back to the Bronze Age? How did this come about? What does that even mean? What's going on here? And how is it connected to the Claremont Institute?
Oh, the Bronze Age fellow has been affirmatively reviewed in the Claremont Institute, has been connected to them in these types of ways. I think he's contributed to one of their publications. I mean, he's just like Scott Yenor or like the raw egg nationalist guy. He's just sort of this bubbling up from the manosphere dude. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, this is a community seething with resentments of, dare I say it, second-tier males.
So what policies do you think? Are there any policies, how much is this actually being influenced and how influential is this mindset? Or is it just is this just an example of how crazy they are? Or is this actually making inroads and making a difference, say, in Ron DeSantis with the cabinets? Are they in cabinet meeting and he's saying, you need to bring back the Bronze Age? I mean, What's happening, along those lines? Anything like?
Absolutely. It absolutely affects policy, unfortunately, because a lot of the folks affiliated with the Claremont Institute have the ear of leading Republican politicians today. Look, Donald Trump is still the front runner. When he attacks woke communists, or when Ron DeSantis talks about, leftist universities or like the elites, or when Ramaswamy talks about the administrative state. These are the top three Republican candidates for president. And all of this kind of verbiage is coming out of the Claremont Institute. So these attitudes affect legislation and state administrations, and very directly in places like Florida, where education policy is now shaped by Claremont affiliated folks like Christopher Rufo and Scott Yenor. We can't sort of dismiss this as some think tank that has no influence. I think when people hear attacks on the administrative state, which I think Ramaswamy said I watched the Republican debates, he attacked the administrative state. Often people don't really understand what that means, and in the Claremont context, it means aspects. They really want to tear it all down. Have they thought it through? And when we think about the administrative state, are we talking about food safety? Are we talking about, air traffic controllers? Are we talking about, civil servants who get up every day and keep politics to the side and go about doing their jobs? But they're talking about taking down these institutions of government. They see, they think that the principles of equality and pluralism are so threatening. And the fact that there might be a diversity, equity, inclusion department in some HR of some company or some university, they think this is so terrible that they've decided they just want to burn it all down. And they have found political justifications for that. And they articulate them very clearly. Think about it. John Eastman is one of the key people in the January 6th plot. He was directly involved in plotting to overthrow the government. And when you hear his justifications for his actions, they all come straight from Claremont Ideology 101. In an interview that was posted recently, I think through Right Wing Watch originally, but has been picked up by others, he gave an interview. I think it's on YouTube or it's online, with the chairman and chief funder of the Institute, a fellow named Klingenstein. So he cites the Declaration of Independence, and he says that effectively we're in a state of war with what he calls the liberal regime. And he said, we have a natural right to replace the existing government that we, the right-thinking people, prefer, and any means are justified when it comes to taking on the woke, and even overthrowing democracy itself, undermining free and fair elections. And that's the kind of thing you can only believe if you've been swilling the Claremont Institute Kool-Aid for a long time.
That's so wild. What's weird is, so like, I'm a big sci-fi buff. Like, I like watching, big Marvel fan, big Star Wars. And like you watch, like the antagonist, like the Empire, and you're like, how is it that all these people, are kind of in agreement with, what Darth Vader and like all these other figure, like, there's no way. You got thousands of people, like, and they all believe this, and one of the things I got out of your reporting, especially kind of with the influence of these think tanks, is like, okay, I could see how this can happen. I could see how people are like, yeah, the Empire's great, Empire's good, they got my best interest at heart. But like, I'm curious, because you said something earlier that I wasn't aware of, that the Claremont Institute isn't tied to the college, and it's just a think tank. So like, how does the Claremont Institute differ from some of these other conservative think tanks, like AEI, Heritage, I'm sure there's some others I'm forgetting, but like, how does it compare to those other institutions?
Well, something that's really interesting, if you're thinking about something that's very interesting about this, is that it's not like a sort of religious right think tank in the way that, some of the, or it's not like a policy group in the way that something like Heritage Foundation is, or something like, the Family Research Council. It's not a group for mobilizing the masses, but it is going to be sort of giving the marching orders to leaders of these organizations that do mobilize the masses, even as it sort of whispers in the ears of politicians. And if you look at different think tanks specifically, they all have, their different wheelhouses. So there's a lot of synergy between, I'm thinking about, like the Heartland Institute or the Acton Institute. They each have their own kind of wheelhouse, but there is a lot of synergy there. But it sort of does, think the question of where does the, people, we all know about religious nationalism now. We all know about the sort of theocratic right. And this is something else. They're almost like working on a common project together, but in different ways. But I also see, as I mentioned with you earlier, some points of difference. So I think that, if these organizations do kind of succeed in getting closer to their goals, I could see that there might eventually be certain types of points of fracture.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things you mentioned in the article, and I'm sure this is obviously a hot button for anyone when it comes to politics, is donors and funding, right? You have these massive donors who have agendas and they have biases and they give huge amounts of money. And all of us see, it's so hard because they can use the money as they want. How much is it influencing? Yet it is influencing because it's money, and it just goes back and forth so much. But what is the difference? What do you think the difference is, say, between the Claremont Institute and its funding and the bias that it's getting in its funding than another parallel liberal institute, the Center for American Progress, or any number of the liberal institutes and think tanks that are in Washington taking donors, huge donations from, biased. You'd have to, you'd have to say they're biased and they have agenda. And, both sides obviously take huge amounts of money from their donors that all have some kind of bias. So talk about that specifically, what makes it so concerning with the Claremont Institute or closely paralleled other conservative think tanks.
I think there's a huge difference between advocating for policies that you prefer and trying to overthrow our government. And tear down democracy itself. We all have a right to vote according to our values. We all have a right to argue for, why our policy should be, favored in government. None of us are going to get everything we want. We're a big, noisy democracy. We're all going to have to make compromises at the end of the day. But there's a very big difference between saying, I want to argue for whatever policy you want, and saying, we just want to blow it all up. And by the way, we're really cool with people, overthrowing elections. And, we think that, democracy, principles of democracy are trash. And we think America should be ruled by a right-thinking elite that are going to use the power of government to impose their will on everyone else through anti-democratic means.
Yeah. And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When you talked about, Eastman's, role in January 6th is kind of straight out of their playbook. What specifically are you referring to? Does the Claremont Institute have a charter or, a value statement that basically says we have to have the president that we want by all costs, by all means, or something what are you referring to that his actions are straight out of their playbook?
They don't have a charter, as far as I know, to that effect, but they platform people who say that kind of thing in multiple ways. So platforming those type of people and elevating them and sort of helping them in their careers, for sure.
Got it. And like where does Eastman kind of fall sort of in the org chart within the Claremont Institute?
He's on their board of directors. I think I checked a few days ago and he was still there.
That's really
nice.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a disqualifying.
Oh. I also got a fundraising appeal letter from him, which I thought was really interesting.
That is funny.
I don't know. I'm on some kind of email list, and I got, I'm having a lot of trouble with my legal bills. It's amazing. It's interesting. I was recently at the Reawaken America tour in Las Vegas. I have a piece coming out about that in the New Republic in the next day or two. You guys know what the Reawaken America tour is?
We were
right?
invited to it.
We had. Oh, really? You got to go.
Well,
you got to go.
We also spoke. We actually had Clay Clark on our show and chatted with him about it.
Oh, really interesting. How did that go?
Yeah, it was awesome. It was interesting. You should watch it.
I'm going to watch that. Okay, so you walk in, every single conspiracy is being promoted. For people who are listening and don't know what it is, Reawaken America is an organization founded in 2021. And there's 2021, they've done dozens of events all around the country, typically in mega churches, drawing in thousands. Each Reawaken thing draws in thousands of people. It's a pro-Trump conspiracy fest. And from the stage and, in the audience, you'll hear every single conspiracy. Alex Jones was invited to speak at the one I was at. A number of other, like very Stu Peters, people who are talking about, the Great Replacement. They're saying that, the world, it's all about, they just repeat every racist, anti-Semitic conspiracy you can possibly imagine. For a lot of health misinformation, health conspiracy. The vaccines are injecting chips into people and to control their behavior or kill people. And they want to replace real Americans with aliens. All this kind of nonsense. But and you can't believe that. Although I saw a lot of QAnon stuff, but two things really struck me, as they do every time I go to Reawaken America. Is like, no, not everybody believes in every conspiracy there, but they all believe in the lie of the stolen election, and they're all told that America is just hopelessly corrupt. And the effect of separating people from the facts, which is something that the MAGA wing of the Republican Party has done pretty successfully. 60% of Republicans now believe that the election was stolen from Trump, and they've done it by separating people from the facts and spreading all this conspiracism. It makes them unreasonable. It makes America harder to govern, makes our country less governable, because it's really hard to come to a consensus when, one group of people is trying to talk about rational policy, and discuss the facts, and the other party is spewing this kind of nonsense. And that, by making our country less governable, it clears the way for a crisis which will inspire an authoritarian reaction. And that's, on a different way, in a much more sort of highbrow way, I'm seeing that kind of thing coming from the Claremont Institute, where many of the writers who contribute to their publications are hoping for an authoritarian reaction. And that's what they think we need to sort of destroy American democracy to save America.
Man, that's really concerning. We look at the two sides in our country, and it feels like such division in the media. And like I said, Will mentioned, I pastor church, and in my church, I have people that believe all over the spectrum in terms of what happened on January 6th, what happened with the election, what happened with all sorts of different political events that have taken place. One thing actually that is like, to me, would like, I probably should say this in the next conversation I have about January 6th, to say, like, if Hillary had done what Trump did in 2016, what would the conservative people in America have done? They would have absolutely
She used email,
lost.
and it was a scandal. She used her email server, and that was a scandal. I mean,
So,
Obama.
I do wonder
and that
about
was a
that.
Scandal.
Yeah, I do wonder about that, because I would have people tell me all the time Obama's creating concentration camps up in Wisconsin, and he's going to take conservatives there, and all this stuff, right? And none of it was true that I saw or anything like that, right? Never seen any real evidence for it. So, but at the core, though, like, one of the things that you critique about the Claremont, which the more you're painting the picture of the Claremont, and I don't know much about them, I would like to know more as I have time and can actually study them. But the more you talk about the Claremont Institute, and even projecting wider from there to like this massive, almost complex of ideological factories, right? This idea on the right side. What do you think about the comparison? Again, in my mind, I'm always like, okay, there's two different sides. Are they doing something different? Is the left doing something different in terms of ideological factories than the right? I mean, in general, like Claremont Institute, I can see that, but even spreading out, are you seeing this in the other ones where there's something drastically different than you're seeing on the left in terms of their efforts to try to convince people of certain ideology?
I see that there is like a far right, and I see that there is a far left. I think that a big difference is that some of the sort of far left policies are not trying to be mainstreamed within the Democratic Party. For the most part, maybe not exclusively, but for the most part, like the Democratic Party center is much more aligned with policies that are actually in alignment with what Americans are concerned with. Right now, they're building infrastructure. They're this sort of terribly titled Inflation Reduction Act has actually produced a lot of positive economic outcomes, policies that are going to sort of try to help working families. And on the other side, you have the extremists who have been kind of absorbed with and taken over, I think, one of our two major political parties. And I think our country functions best when we have two rational political parties,
for sure,
who might have different ideas how to get there, but acknowledge that we can have some common interests. We all want a stable, prosperous country filled with, happy families, right? So you might have different ideas about how to get there, and then you engage in the sort of politics of give and take that are necessary in a complex democracy. But when you have one party that is mainstreaming, that is cultivating resentments, mainstreaming propaganda and conspiracism, and treating the opposition not as loyal opposition, but as literally demonic, and satanic, and normalizing the rhetoric of racial I was going to say racial violence, yes, and also of political violence, then it just makes the country again less governable. It's interesting. I was at the one of these large right-wing gatherings. I think it was Road to Majority, and Trump said the most dangerous enemy America faces, is not our foreign enemy, as dangerous as they may be. The most pressing enemy, the most dangerous enemy is the political opposition. Is the most dangerous enemy is internal. So he's not trying to unite Americans under a common sort of patriotic project. He is targeting more than half of Americans as demonic and satanic. And you hear that kind of demon language normalized at a lot of these gatherings at Reawaken America. Oh, yeah. They're constantly talking about how, I come here to declare war on every, satanic, demonic Democrat. They're unhuman. Demonizing whole groups of people is just a really dangerous thing to do, because
Absolutely.
it clears the way to create a sort of permission structure for not just oppression, but also for political violence. And you simply do not hear that on the part of the, mainstream Democratic side at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that so when I'm trying to wrap my head around everything that's happening in the conservative side, because I've been a conservative my whole life, right? And so, but I want to be a critical conservative. I don't want to accept things that like people are being replaced by aliens unless you show me like really irrefutable proof. I also don't want to say that I would never say, oh, it's impossible that the election was stolen. I wouldn't say that, because sure, it's possible that it was. I don't know how probable it is, but it's certainly possible. And you have to then present evidence for that. But when we're looking at these, when we're looking at this broad spectrum, even of conservatives or even within the Claremont Institute, are there any scholars that you would like, or ideas that you find reasonable and worth engaging in right now when you're looking at what are some of those ideas that you feel like this is the good thing to engage with, to talk about, so that when I'm talking to my friends or whatever who think the election was stolen, I can say, hey, let's have a more reasonable conversation about this or whatever it is. Not necessarily about the election in particular, I'm saying for you, but what kind of ideas are out there? How do we interact on the other side and get to a common?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that when it comes to the Claremont Institute, they do draw in a lot of different writers. And of course that there are, they focus a lot on the sort of woke. And of course, there are some criticisms that can be made of some of the diversity, equity and inclusion programs out there. And sometimes those critiques do make it into the pages of the Claremont Institute in ways that are, I would say, worth considering. But the fact that they have such a deep bench when it comes to fascist nuts makes it really hard to sort of, take it seriously. I mean, people are people. You go to some of these gatherings
sure.
that, you go to the Reawaken America, which is a different thing. I mean, let's be clear, it's not tied to the Claremont Institute. But you go and you talk to people, and they do articulate concerns that sometimes I share. I think about, of course, I'm a mom. I want my kids to be learning age appropriate material in their schools, but my solution to a book that I don't like isn't to just blow up the schools or show up at school board meetings and be incredibly disruptive and direct this kind of and threaten violence to school board members and teachers who are basically just trying to do their jobs, or ban every single book that has a mention of something that I don't happen to like. I mean, that's not
that's not good.
It's amazing for a movement that claims to defend free speech that they're completely comfortable suppressing ideas that they don't like.
Yeah.
Oh, here's the other thing. I mean, they're really supporting people like Scott Yenor, who's was brought into Florida to help DeSantis direct his stuff. He claims to be against diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and he's basically setting up an affirmative action program for conservative men. That's what he's doing. He's saying, we should discourage women from going to fields like engineering and medicine, and instead, recruit men to those fields. Well, if you're discouraging women from doing it, you're offering an affirmative action program for men. If you're, he said, any academic program, including nursing and education, that attracts more women. He specifically singled out nursing and education. If an education programs attract more women than men, we need to do investigate them. Like, are you kidding me?
Gosh, so Scott Uter, he's the Boise State University professor.
Yeah, he's that guy.
That guy. I'm curious if you can talk about what the Claremont Institute's like primary focus, either stated or implied. And just to kind of put it in context. So we were fortunate to have Kevin Roberts on our show, and, Heritage is all about school choice, vouchers, all kinds of stuff, and then we had Robert Doer. I can't remember how to say his last name, but from the AEI, from the president of AEI, and their focus was opportunity, like social mobility. So like what's Claremont's, primary focus as you see it?
I mean, just if a lot of it is on what they would call wokeness, but they have a whole bunch of. If you look at the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, it's pretty broad.
Got it. And on that, so on that, the review of books, you mentioned something in your article about that, like how it used to be kind of like a respected. I don't know if it's like a New York Times bestseller kind of thing, but
it's like traditional conservative. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bill Kristol has been observing them for a long time, and he's like, it used to be more on the traditional conservative side, but I think if you start looking into it, you can see the roots of some of the extremism that they're endorsing today, and they really don't call out the extremists. There have been these very wonderfully done investigations in both the Bulwark and also the Federalist conservative publications. The Laura Field and, there's a fellow at Federalist who's written about them, and I can't recall his name, but those pieces are worth looking into to sort of understand how the Claremont Institute has sort of separated itself and moved away from traditional conservatism.
Yeah, when I look at our current situation, it is very concerning. And as a pastor with a lot of friends who are pastors going into this next election season, I'm not looking forward to it. Not looking forward to the criticisms that are going to come out. Not looking forward to the anger that we are going to see. Not looking forward to the cherry picking that happens, and just people group think style, just saying whatever it is in their ideological, echo chamber that they feel like they need to say without much investigation.
I think it must be very difficult because you don't want to alienate part of your congregation.
Absolutely.
Have you ever been to any of these pastor gatherings like Faith Wins or Watchmen on the Wall?
No, I haven't. I haven't even heard of them.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, Watchmen on the Wall has done hundreds of gatherings all across the country. Faith Wins has done dozens across the country. They draw in conservative-leaning pastors. You should look into them and go because they're really interesting. They draw in, thousands of pastors all taken together. And I've been to gatherings of both. I went to most recently a church in Virginia with dozens of pastors from the area, and then they have presentations from who David Barton is, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. His son gave a presentation, talking about America's, conservative Christian founding, and but really with a certain very political spin. According to the Bartons, George Washington himself would want us all to be voting Republican. He's talking about how pastors are sort of idealizing the moment when pastors threw off in the Revolutionary period, threw off their robes and took up guns and led their congregants into battle. And basically saying, the church is not a cruise ship, the church is a battleship, as they literally say this. Chad Connolly from the Council for National Policy is up there talking about how you get your congregants out there to vote their biblical values. And then they had with them a fellow named Hogan Gidley, who was billed as an election integrity specialist, who's there to spread lies about the election. And this was a few weeks after a Republican-led committee in Arizona. Do you remember the cyber ninjas? and they suspected voter fraud. They did an investigation, and this Republican-led committee said, we didn't find any voter fraud. In fact, we found a slightly large, like couple dozen extra accounts for extra votes for Biden. So yeah, we did our best to find the fraud, but we couldn't find it. But Hogan Gidley is there telling these pastors, you all saw what happened in Arizona, didn't you? And it's like he's spreading this lie that's been debunked by a bunch of Republicans, a Republican-led committee that was frankly motivated to find corruption and couldn't. Then he said, dead people are voting, they're registering dead people and sort of spreading all this sort of conspiracism. And, the pastors in attendance were listening, and most of them are not glued to the news like I am, and probably you are in some ways. So they weren't following what was happening with that investigation with the Republican cyber ninjas in Arizona. So they couldn't say, wait a minute. You're saying that there's corruption, but they found no corruption. So I've been to, and then they give out voter guides that leave absolutely no question. It all boils down to 2 or 3 issues. It's abortion. Yep. It's the sort of, same-sex marriage, which they think is somehow undermining to, like, I don't know. I can't think of a single issue that my husband and I have. I could blame on our gay friends. I don't know, what they're going on with about that, but,
Yeah, it's so funny. I saw this meme recently where it said, it was like a tip to deal with people that have conspiracy theories. And they're like, if you have someone that has a conspiracy theory, one way to kind of stop the conversation is to come up with a crazier conspiracy theory about that links to their current conspiracy theory. So like if someone says, hey, did you know that there's a bunch of dead people voting? Then like you come up with a conspiracy like, yeah, and these resurrected people are because they're eating from Chick-fil-A, or something like that.
Have you tried that, and does it work?
I've tried it with friends, and they just look at me kind of with a side eye, like whatever will. I get the whatever will a lot, but most conspiracy theorists that I've spoken with are fairly what's the word, like committed to the conspiracy. I have quite a few friends right now that are trying to push this, space lasers that are causing forest fires.
Oh my gosh! Really?
Yeah.
Like the Maui stuff?
Yes.
If you look at the Maui Twitter feed when that stuff was happening, I would say 2 out of every 3 posts, if you just put Maui in your search bar, was some kind of weird conspiracist. And it's all about, I see that as essential to the destruction of our democracy. It's when you have a sector of the population that is drawn into unreason, it makes the country less governable, which makes an authoritarian reaction more likely. And it's interesting, when I was at the Reawaken America, I saw we know what happened to JFK. And then I was reminded of 9/11, interestingly, when I was working on this and all the sort of conspiracism around 9/11, when I was working on this Claremont Institute stuff. And all of those, those kinds of conspiracies draw in people across the political spectrum, but they end up, often drawing those people toward gatherings like Reawaken America or the podcasts and sort of all the social media stuff that swirls around that. And it ends up, that's how you end up with this kind of a less equitable society.
And I think probably the bigger concern for me is, so you've got Russian troll farms. There's a report I read recently about, China's influence kind of in the information space for conspiracy theories. And when you talk to people and you say, hey, I think, Russia's really pushing this, election was stolen thing. And then you find a lot of conspiracy theorists finding favor with these regimes that
pro-Russia, pro-Putin.
Yeah, well, he's just telling the truth, and you're like, what? Like, what?
It's not intended to make America stronger. It's not intended to make us a secure and prosperous country. It is intended to weaken us and offer that security to our, geopolitical adversaries.
Yeah, and I mean it's really sad. But I want to ask you just a few more questions, just in the remaining time that we've got here. But how does this article, if at all, relate to the book you wrote, The Power Worshippers? Because I know that you did a lot of really great research in that book, and I can sort of see somewhat of a nexus. But I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, these are two groups that sort of, we know about the theocratic right, and we know about the sort of alt-right, but the Claremont Institute is something different. And in some ways, they're working together, I would say not together, but in some ways they're working like side by side on a common, I would say, anti-democratic project. But I also see some fissures and areas that could at some point become potential problems. So, for instance, I think that when I think about like I would say anti-democratic reaction, I think about three different groups: the funders, the thinkers, and the foot soldiers. Right. So the funders, and these are three very different groups, often that have very different agendas from one another. So the agendas of the funders are going to be very different from the agendas of the foot soldiers, because the funders, a lot of them are motivated more by economic policy, right-wing or libertarian economic policy, and they're not, a lot of them, as interested in right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars, but they sort of create these and amplify these culture war issues to like shiny baubles, so that the foot soldiers will be like distracted. Oh my gosh, there's abortion, trans, whatever, and meanwhile they're voting for that gets them to vote for these economic policies that actually hurt them. So where was I going with this? How does it relate to my book? I think that when I was talking about potential fissures, like I actually think that some of the folks affiliated with Claremont are not necessarily religious right by any means. They sort of will give, they'll pay lip service to it. Like when I went to the World Congress of Families, which I describe in my book, The Power Worshippers, which is an international gathering of sort of the reactionary right. And it's very overtly sort of religious right. John Eastman actually spoke. He gave the closing speech. But if you his speech was not nearly as fiery or as theocratically minded as a lot of the other speeches that I heard at that conference. And if you drill into it and some of the nuances of the language he uses, you can see that he's kind of okay with a kind of more theocratic mindset, but he's not really on board with it necessarily himself. And I think some of these folks are, if you really get down to what they believe, some of them are actually kind of more atheistic, but they're kind of going on with the program because they see themselves as the righteous who should be the elite. They're like after creating a kind of new oligarchy. But would they be really on board with an explicit theocracy? Would the theocrats boot them out at a certain point? Because you're like, you're not really one of us, like you've been useful, but you're not really one of us. I mean, you can't predict the future, but you sort of wonder when people with slightly different, different agendas kind of work together and they get a little further along and what's going to happen. So.
Yeah. And so my last question, and I know Josh has one more too, but this question isn't necessarily tied to the Claremont, but I'd love to get your thoughts, and that's in reference to Liberty University. So like, as long as I can remember from a political standpoint, especially during Jerry Falwell Jr.'s days, it's like all presidential candidates have to go to Liberty and give a speech in order to at least solidify the evangelical vote. But being that liberty has been relatively off the radar, probably for a good reason. The past couple of years, like what effect do you think that will have? And is there another, Christian college, Christian organization that you think is going to be sort of the new standard bearer for presidential candidates?
Well, there are a number of religious colleges out there, and I think that I don't know what's going on internally at Liberty with all of that, but again, Claremont Institute is not a group for mobilizing the masses, so Liberty University doesn't need to fear that they're being given competition from them, but I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It was probably they say ask a bad question, get a bad answer. But it's like I'm wondering like where do politicians go to garner Christian support?
Oh, right. All right. Well, oh my gosh, so many. The machinery of the Christian nationalist movement is all aimed at turning out the vote. And I describe this machinery in detail. And power worshippers, and the movement is leadership driven and organization driven. And it consists of a lot of organizations we can group into categories. There are right-wing policy groups. There are legal advocacy groups. There's a vast sort of a messaging network. There's networking organization, a messaging sphere, I should say. There's networking organizations like the Council for National Policy. You've got a lot of think tanks. You've got policy groups like Heritage, Family Research Council, American Family Association. All of these organizations work together in election cycles to get out the vote. And then the movement has been really successful in sort of animating culture wars around public education, which have always been bubbling in the background, simmering since there's a sort of long-standing hostility to public education. But the movement kind of weaponized a lot of the in some ways legitimate resentments that people felt, or frustration, certainly legitimate frustrations during the COVID years. And sort of now there's groups like Moms for Liberty and other sort of groups when you go back to the leaders, not just, it's in a way they're in the new Tea Party because they're activating people on the local level. All politics is local. And some of the issues they articulate may appear to be quite legitimate. Look, I'm a mom. I want my kids to be learning stuff that's age appropriate in their schools. But I went to their conference, again, they had this crazy conspiracist, I can't remember his name, but he gets up there and he's talking about how, the Democrats are creating these gulags. That's just like communist. We've become just like communist China. I'm like, are you kidding me? Look out the window. There's nothing like communist China. And then you had David Barton there, sort of giving his son, Tim Barton, doing the same stuff that he does in these sort of ultra, so it's deeply partisan. It's really not, it would be wonderful if we could sort of focus on some of these issues in a nonpartisan way and say, okay, let's figure out what's appropriate for kids to read, and without people trying to, ban a book because it talks about racial justice. I mean, for goodness sake, it's just ridiculous. And but those groups, all taken all together, they act as a kind of voter turnout machine. And, every Republican politician who has an aspiration of a real career knows that they're not going to be able to succeed without getting the support of this movement, because they're the ones with the money and the manpower to turn out the vote. So, that's the thing. And thanks, by the way, to race-based gerrymandering, we have a lot of states where Republican politicians are never going to run against a Democrat because of the gerrymandering. So they're always going to run against another Republican, and the only way they're going to get the support of the voter turnout machine and their money and their manpower is to run to the right of their political opposition. So that's the way they win, is by embracing these extreme positions and running to the right of their political opposition. And that, like, the consequence of that has drawn, frankly, the Republican Party off to the right, and reduced the chances of consensus and collaboration. Some of the issues that we, frankly, need together to come together with other parties in order to achieve policies that are going to benefit all Americans.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you were talking, I was thinking about how the gerrymandering is one of the most concerning things that I have that happens on both parties. And I think that gerrymandering should be stopped personally. I don't know enough about it to give some nice big argument that explains why, but I just think you're always going to either go further left or further right. The closer you get to the center means the closer you get to the opposing party. And so you're going to be incentivized to go further right or further left. And it's just never good to incentivize the extremes. But I would say, and the question is, obviously, I'm a conservative. I have a lot of conservative friends, a lot of conservative family. What is your appeal to reasonable conservatives moving into this election, moving into this new season of trying to figure out how we're going to keep going as a country? What's your appeal to reasonable, well, all Republicans, all conservatives, but reasonable conservatives?
I think that, there are more Americans. Here's something that gives me hope. There are more Americans that support democracy than those who do not. And I think that, preserving our democracy, conserving is a conservative project in many regards, right? So, we should seek to preserve institutions that have served us over time rather than tear them down. Of course, they can, there are institutions that there's always room for improvement. Nothing is perfect, but, their progress can happen. But, I do think we need a big tent. I mean, I was at a religious right conference. Again, it was like another Road to Majority a couple months ago. And, one of the speakers said, if someone, it's a big, noisy democracy. He didn't say this. This is what I'm going to say. Big, noisy democracy. We're not all going to get everything we want. But what he said was, like, if somebody agrees with you 80%, but there's 20% that you disagree with, that's not your enemy. That's an 80% friend, not a 20% enemy. We do need a really big tent, and we all need to sort of stop looking for perfection and come together, like find common ground. And I think that if we can do that, then we have a chance of using the tools of the democratic political process to restore and preserve our democracy.
That's awesome. Well, so how can people access, your article and just overall just the work that you're doing?
Thank you so much. I try to post a lot of it on katherinestewart.me. It's my website. It needs to be updated. I'm on Twitter as Kath S. Stewart. There's 2 S's there, Kath S. Stewart. And my book is The Power Worshippers. It's available where books are sold, and I am working on another book. So hope to see you guys in another year when that eventually comes out.
That's awesome. Actually, if you're writing another book, what would be really helpful for us is if you can just send us pages of it so we can kind of read it, as we go. Cause like we get so many like books from publishers. And I'm just like, I don't know, I'm going to read all these. And I really feel committed to like read the book, like if we're going to talk to the person, I want to actually read it. So I'm just throwing that out there for you. If you want to just, create a group.
When it's ready, I'll send you a description.
Awesome. Well,
that's awesome.
We will make sure that we put a link to the article, the Claremont Institute, the anti-democracy think tank. It's the front page of the New Republic. So, kudos for that. So it would be kind of hard to miss if you are already reading the New Republic. We'll also put a link for your book in the notes as well. And just thank you for your time, Katherine. This has been awesome.
Thanks to both of you for the terrific conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and to our viewers and listeners, we will see you next week. Take care. Bye.